Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I'm going to do a book review of Viking Wars by Max Adams. This was my first read for Nonfiction November, and so I thought I'd do a review of the book because I really liked it, and it gives me an opportunity to kind of talk about nonfiction on my channel again. So Max Adams is a professor, he's an author, he's a woodsman, he's a writing coach. He was an archaeologist at a university, or he was the director of archaeology at a university in England, and he's written a lot of books about a lot of different topics, but one of the topics he seems to come back to most often is England around somewhere between the 7th and the 11th centuries, the time period in which King Alfred the Great would have lived and exercised his influence over England and shaping the future of at least a partially unified England. Okay, so the full title of this book is The Viking Wars, War and Peace in King Alfred's Britain. And from my point of view, it's kind of actually an attempt to demythologize a little bit of Alfred's reputation as the first king of a unified England, as a unifier in general. In some ways, it actually gives a more realistic impression of Alfred as a military leader, as a political leader, and kind of all the things that he had to be able to do, and all the relationships he had to be able to maintain to stay the king of Wessex and the overlord of Mercia. And how he extended his rule a little bit, and how he, at one time, at some points, drove the Vikings out of his territory, and it sometimes made concessions to them, and sometimes helped to try to assimilate them and bring him under his kind of overall rule. The book relies heavily on chronicles written at the time period. Oftentimes these chroniclers actually worked for the kings or the leaders who they wrote about, so there's a fair amount of propaganda and bias in what they wrote. It also relies on the archaeological record. That's probably not surprising given the fact that Adams was an archaeologist. And so there's a whole lot about archaeological digs and what they found, digs in towns and communities, digs involving discovering hoards of treasure, digs involving burial mounds, and then the results of those digs, and what they say about the assimilation of the Norse people into the culture of England, from pottery to coins, the names of towns and all kinds of things get kind of mixed together into this, and to create this much fuller picture of England at the time of King Alfred. That it's not a matter of King Alfred driving out the Vikings or subduing all the Vikings, but more or less establishing himself in his kingdom, and then attempting to create a living relationship almost with the Viking invaders who settled in really controlled large chunks of northern England. A lot of what the book emphasizes, and this I think is actually one of the things that's most intriguing about it and best about it, is that it has a tendency to emphasize how much we don't actually know. These are oftentimes the story of King Alfred, or stories about Vikings, are things that we think we know a lot about, but in reality, a lot of that, what we think we know, is based on historical conjecture, based oftentimes on things that are not necessarily provable at this time. And so the Viking Wars forces us to kind of reassess lots of ideas. It forces us to reassess what we think about Vikings. What we think about Vikings are these great marauding warriors who, came in and took what they wanted and were an unstoppable military force. They really weren't. There are no more expert warriors than existed in Wessex or Mercia or anywhere in England or Ireland. They might have been more skilled at sailing ships and navigation, but they weren't more skilled fighters. And the book actually kind of emphasizes how much the Vikings came as settlers. And therefore, a lot of what the book actually talks about is kind of this process of assimilating the Vikings into English culture, or maybe a better way of looking at it is kind of blending those two things together. The book also is a kind of a reassessment or a reappraisal of Alfred as a warrior king, and more of an appreciation of Alfred as a scholar king, as a negotiator king, as a politically adept king who knew how to manipulate situations, who knew when to use force and when to back down even, and when to seek peace and extension of his power and territory in other ways. The book spends a lot of time on the organization of the southern part of England, where Alfred was dominant in Wessex, and his relationships with the other kind of regional kingdoms around there. The relationship between Wessex and Mercia was worked out before and during Alfred's reign. It talks a lot about the rivalry between what are really dozens of small regional kingdoms and regional territories that stretched all the way from Cornwall to Essex to Wales to York to Scotland to Northern Ireland to Dublin to the Isle of Man. There's a lot about all these kind of regional kings and powers and the shifting alliances that took place between them. Sometimes they allied themselves with the Vikings, sometimes they fought the Vikings, sometimes they fought one another, sometimes they allied with one another against the Vikings. It's really kind of fascinating, and I think one of the things it gives you a greater appreciation of is essentially how sophisticated those people were in their political thinking, and how sophisticated a king like Alfred was in his understanding of how to achieve the goals of stability and increasing his power, and how all these other kingdoms worked on the same things and strove for the same goals. There's also a good deal of discussion about the politics and the economics and the combination of those things, and how the gifting of land to the church, to nobles, to your enemies, how marrying your daughters into these families kind of knit these relationships together and made them stronger, and kind of slowly, almost incrementally, lead to an increasingly unified England under Alfred and his successors. Adams does a great job of introducing us to new, or perhaps I should probably say they were new to me, but maybe not in England, they're not, to little-known characters from this time period, like Alfred's grandson, Aethelstan, who did a lot to expand Alfred's kingdom, and who in some ways laid the groundwork for an extended and more unified England under that family than even Alfred did. If Alfred got the ball rolling, Aethelstan is the one who really built from that and attempted to expand that further north into northern territories in England, which meant that at times he fought Vikings, at times he absorbed Vikings under his leadership. At all times he's looking to expand the territory and the power of his kingdom, which is all kind of working towards a more unified England. We're also introduced to, I'm going to mispronounce her name, but I'm going to call her Aethelfed, who is King Alfred's daughter, who he married to the king of Mercia, and creating a really solid alliance between Wessex and Mercia. And Aethelfed is an incredibly powerful, independent, influential leader of this time period. And oftentimes, again, we don't think about women having these kind of political power, but she was a force to be reckoned with in Mercia. And along with her brother Edmund and then her nephew Aethelstan, she did a lot to solidify the achievements or the gains that King Alfred had made. Okay, so the Viking Wars is a very good book. I enjoyed it thoroughly. As you're reading it, you realize that Adams is really good at what he does, because you are absorbing a lot of the basics of the story, a lot of the kind of things that tie all these pieces of all these hundreds of names and place names and people names together, and you're kind of getting the overall picture, even if you don't remember all the details at the end of reading. This is an impressive work of kind of collective scholarship. Having said that, there are a couple of things that I think would perhaps trouble readers when they look at it. Number one, Adams' style is an acquired taste. Occasionally he writes strictly as an academic. Sometimes he's conversational. Sometimes he introduces modern terms and concepts, and once you get used to it, it's really enjoyable. In addition, there's some details I think it's worth warning readers about. Adams insists on using as close to the original spellings as he can. This is something that actually makes it, for me, more difficult to remember who exactly we're talking about. I mean, King Alfred's name is easily understandable, and you know who that is, but it does make it harder to keep track of a lot of these other people. So here's an example. So he says, how to unpick this? To start with the realpolitik of early medieval North, we can say that there were historical antipathy between the kings of southern Northumbria, that is, ancient Deria, and the lords of Bamberg, formerly the seats of kings of Bernicia. St. Cuthbert had been a protege of the Bernician dynasty of Oswald, now a posthumous cult figure in Mercia, but since the infamous raid on Lindisfarne in 793, the weakness of Bernician royal authority had driven Cuthbert's community west and south on an epic 7-year tour around their lands until they settled on their estate in Chester-le-Street. These territories were the ancient marcher lands between Derry and Bernicia, and it seems that by cleverly sponsoring the half-Scandinavian Goldrohr in the early 880s, the community had taken up a buffer position between the two rival kingdoms. It's not that that's not understandable, it is, but there is an avalanche of place names and things you kind of have to work your way through, which can be really, really challenging, but it doesn't take away from the quality of the book itself. So additionally, another thing to be aware of is the book is not, strictly speaking, chronological. You move steadily through the time periods, and the time periods of the book are 789 to 955, but he does have a tendency to reference forward and backward to things that are going to happen and things that have already happened, and in part this is because he is trying to talk about and write about so many different people and kingdoms and groups of people and places that I guess that's somewhat inevitable. My biggest complaint about the book is this: there aren't enough maps. The biggest maps in the book are located on the end papers. Publisher Adams has divided the map of England in half, and it's already a busy map with lots of place names. The ancient names are the names that are on the map. And it can make it really difficult to follow. You know, you're reading along, you think, okay, I need to figure out where that is on the map geographically, and then you have to guess. If you're not sure, you have to guess, is that going to be in the map with at the front of the book where the top of England is in the map, you know, England and Scotland, or is the map at the bottom of the back of the book where the southern half of England is on the map? And that does make it confusing, and there are just not enough maps in the book. And it seems to me that having a map specifically related to the major themes of each chapter or the places going to be discussed in each chapter would have made the book better. But that's my only real criticism, because I really liked the book. It was one of those books that made you feel like you're flexing your brain a little bit, and that's an enjoyable experience, and one of the things I think that makes reading history worthwhile and makes reading nonfiction such a great thing. Anyway, let me know what you think. Thank you for watching.